The driver's daughter took over her sick father's job, and the millionaire fell in love with her. Hey there, tell us in the comments where you're tuning in from before we start. And once the story ends, make sure to give it a score from 0 to 10. Enjoy the ride. She never imagined that answering a phone call at 3 a.m. would change her entire life. Madison Parker sat on the edge of her narrow bed in the cramped apartment she shared with her father, staring at the hospital discharge papers scattered across her kitchen table. The fluorescent light above flickered intermittently, casting harsh shadows across the medical bills that seemed to multiply every time she looked away. Her father, Thomas Parker, lay sleeping on the worn couch, his breathing still labored from the heart attack that had struck him 3 days ago. The doctor said he was lucky. If Madison hadn't found him collapsed in the hallway when she came home from her night shift at Memorial Hospital, he might not have made it. But luck felt like a cruel joke when you couldn't afford to miss work, and your father's 23-year career as a private driver was suddenly hanging by a thread. Madison ran her fingers through her shoulder-length brown hair, the same shade as her father's had been before it turned silver. She had inherited his quiet determination and his steady hands that had helped her father maintain the pristine black Mercedes that sat in their building's parking garage, the car that belonged to Jackson Blackwood. The Blackwood name was whispered in corporate circles throughout the East Coast. Jackson had built his logistics and security empire from nothing, turning a small freight company into a multi-billion-dollar operation. Madison had grown up hearing stories about the man her father drove to boardrooms, charity galas, and private airports, a man who demanded precision, punctuality, and absolute discretion. Her phone buzzed. A text from her supervisor at the hospital. "Madison, we need you for a double shift tomorrow. Can you cover?" She stared at the message, her thumb hovering over the keyboard. The extra money would help, but it would also mean leaving her father alone for 16 hours straight. The doctors had been clear. No stress, no heavy lifting, complete rest for at least 6 weeks. 6 weeks without income from his primary job. 6 weeks of watching him grow more restless and worried with each passing day. Madison walked to the window and gazed down at the Mercedes parked under the streetlight. The car that had been her father's pride and joy. The vehicle he'd maintained like a shrine for over 2 decades. She knew every inch of that car, had helped him change the oil, replace the air filters, and polish the chrome until it gleamed. Her father had taught her to drive in that very car during the few times when Mr. Blackwood was out of town. "Feel the road, Madison," he would say, his weathered hands guiding hers on the steering wheel. A good driver doesn't just transport someone from point A to point B. They create an experience. Smooth, safe, invisible. The apartment felt smaller in the pre-dawn darkness. Madison's reflection stared back at her from the window. 24 years old, tired but determined, wearing the same faded scrubs she'd thrown on when the ambulance arrived. Her father had given everything to his work, and now it was her turn to give something back. She had never met Jackson Blackwood face to face. In all the years her father had worked for him, she'd only caught glimpses of him through tinted windows or at a distance. But she knew his schedule by heart. Her father had rehearsed it so many times that Madison could recite the weekly routine like a prayer. Monday through Friday, pick up at 6:30 a.m. sharp from the penthouse on 5th Avenue. First stop, the private gym on the Upper West Side. Then the office by 8 a.m. where he'd remain until exactly 6 p.m., unless there were evening meetings or business dinners. The routine never varied. The man apparently lived his life like a precisely calibrated machine. Madison made her decision in the space between heartbeats. She walked to her father's bedroom and quietly opened the closet. His driver's uniform hung there, pressed and waiting. Black suit, white shirt, black tie, and the small silver pin that marked him as a certified executive protection driver. The clothes were too big for her, but they would have to do. At 6 a.m., Madison sat behind the wheel of the Mercedes, her hands gripping the leather steering wheel the same way her father had taught her. She'd arrived at the penthouse building 15 minutes early, just as he always did. The doorman had given her a curious look but said nothing. He recognized the car, even if he didn't recognize the driver. The elevator chimed at exactly 6:30 a.m. Jackson Blackwood stepped out of the building, his tall frame cutting a sharp silhouette against the morning light. He moved with the efficient grace of someone who had never had to wait for anything in his life. His dark hair was perfectly styled, his charcoal suit tailored to perfection, and his expression was set in the neutral mask of a man who had learned to keep the world at arm's length. He approached the car, his phone already pressed to his ear as he spoke in clipped, businesslike tones. Madison's heart hammered against her ribs as she stepped out, and moved to open the rear door. Jackson paused mid-sentence, his piercing blue eyes meeting hers for the first time. For a moment, the busy Manhattan street fell silent around them. He took in her appearance, the too large uniform, the nervous set of her shoulders, the way she stood with quiet dignity, despite the obvious improvisation of her situation. "Who are you?" His voice was deeper than she'd expected, carrying the kind of authority that came from years of commanding boardrooms and making decisions that affected thousands of lives. Madison lifted her chin, drawing on every ounce of strength her father had instilled in her. "I'm Madison Parker, Mr. Blackwood. I'm here to drive you." His eyes narrowed slightly. "Where's Thomas?" "He's recovering. I'm filling in for him." Jackson's gaze swept over her again, and Madison felt as though he was cataloging every detail. Her steady hands, the way she held his door open without fidgeting, the respect in her posture despite the circumstances. "I don't recall authorizing a replacement." "You didn't, but you need to be at the gym by 7 a.m. and your office by 8. I know the routes, I know your schedule, and I know how to drive." Madison's voice remained calm, professional. "My father taught me well." Jackson stood there for a long moment, his phone call forgotten. Madison could sense him weighing his options: find a new driver and disrupt his carefully maintained routine, or trust the daughter of a man who had never let him down. Finally, he slid into the backseat, his movements precise and controlled. "The gym," he said simply. Madison closed the door and walked around to the driver's seat, her hands trembling slightly as she started the engine. As she pulled away from the curb, she caught his eyes in the rearview mirror. He was watching her intently, and for the first time in her life, Madison felt as though she was being truly seen, not just as Thomas Parker's daughter, but as someone entirely her own. The drive to the gym passed in silence, but it was a silence that hummed with possibility. Madison navigated the morning traffic with the same steady precision her father had taught her, and when she pulled up to the gym's valet station, Jackson paused before getting out. "What time will you be back?" he asked, though they both knew he already knew the answer. "I'll be here at 7:45, Mr. Blackwood." He nodded once, then stepped out of the car. But as he walked toward the gym's entrance, Madison could feel his eyes on her through the glass doors. And for the first time in days, she allowed herself a small smile. But as she drove away to wait for his return, Madison had no idea that the man in the rearview mirror was about to turn her temporary solution into something far more complicated than she'd ever imagined. By the third day, Madison had learned that Jackson Blackwood lived his life like a Swiss watch, precise, predictable, and completely unforgiving of even the smallest deviation. She pulled up to the penthouse building at exactly 6:28 a.m., 2 minutes before the required time. The morning routine had become a careful dance of unspoken expectations. Jackson would emerge from the elevator at 6:30 sharp, his phone already in hand, his expression set in the same neutral mask that revealed nothing about the man beneath the expensive suits. Madison had stopped trying to make conversation after the first day's polite attempts had been met with curt nods and single-syllable responses. Instead, she focused on what she could control: the perfect temperature of the car, the morning news playing softly on the radio, the seamless navigation through Manhattan's chaotic traffic. What she didn't expect was how intensely aware she'd become of his presence in the back seat. The way he tapped his fingers against his phone when he was thinking, the subtle shift in his posture when a business call didn't go as planned, the moment each morning when he would glance up from his screen and their eyes would meet in the rearview mirror, a split second of connection that felt charged with something neither of them acknowledged. This morning was different, though. As Madison waited outside the gym, she noticed a small coffee shop across the street that she'd never paid attention to before. The owner, an elderly man with kind eyes, was setting up his sidewalk display of fresh pastries. The sight reminded her of her father, who had always insisted that the small details were what separated good service from exceptional service. When Jackson emerged from the gym 45 minutes later, his hair slightly damp from the shower, Madison was waiting by the car with something she'd never offered before. "Mr. Blackwood," she said, extending a paper cup. "I thought you might like some coffee. Black, no sugar." Jackson stopped short, his hand halfway to the car door. His eyes moved from the cup to her face, and for a moment, Madison wondered if she'd overstepped some invisible boundary. "How did you know I take it black?" he asked, his voice carrying a note of genuine curiosity. "My father mentioned it once. He said you never add anything to your coffee because you prefer things uncomplicated." Jackson accepted the cup, his fingers brushing against hers for just an instant. The contact sent an unexpected jolt through Madison's system, but she kept her expression neutral. Thomas talks about me? There was something almost vulnerable in the question, as if Jackson had never considered that his driver might see him as more than just a client. He talks about his work, Madison said carefully. He's very proud of the service he provides. Jackson took a sip of the coffee, and Madison caught the slightest hint of surprise in his expression. This is good. Where did you get it? The cafe across the street. Giuseppe's been running it for 30 years. He told me he uses a blend from his hometown in Italy. You talked to him? While I was waiting? He's nice. He asked about the car, wondered if I was new. Madison paused, suddenly self-conscious. I hope that's all right. I know my father keeps things private. Jackson studied her for a long moment, and Madison felt as though he was seeing her clearly for the first time, not just as Thomas Parker's replacement, but as someone with her own thoughts, her own way of moving through the world. It's fine, he said finally, settling into the back seat. Giuseppe's, you said? Yes, sir. The drive to the office passed in the usual silence, but it felt different now, less rigid somehow. Madison found herself stealing glances at Jackson in the mirror, watching as he savored the coffee she'd brought him. When they stopped at a red light, she caught him looking out the window at the city waking up around them, his expression softer than she'd ever seen it. The radio, he said suddenly, as they turned onto Fifth Avenue. Madison's hand froze on the steering wheel. Sir? You changed the station yesterday from the financial news to something else. Her heart sank. She'd been so careful, but apparently not careful enough. I'm sorry, Mr. Blackwood. I didn't realize. What was it? The music you played? Madison blinked, confused by the direction of the conversation. It was classical, a local station that plays instrumental pieces in the morning. I thought it might be more peaceful. Leave it there, Jackson said quietly. The news can wait. By the time they reached his office building, Madison felt as though something fundamental had shifted between them. It was subtle, a crack in the wall of professional distance that had defined their first 3 days together. But it was there, and they both felt it. As Jackson prepared to get out of the car, he paused with his hand on the door handle. Madison, he said, using her name for the first time since their initial meeting. Yes, Mr. Blackwood? Thank you. For the coffee. She watched him walk into the building, his usual brisk stride somehow more relaxed than before. As she pulled away from the curb, Madison found herself smiling, really smiling, for the first time since her father's heart attack. But the smile faded as she remembered the stack of medical bills waiting at home, and the temporary nature of her current situation. Her father was getting stronger every day, which meant that soon, very soon, she would have to give up these morning drives and return to her life as a hospital aide. The thought should have brought relief. Instead, it left her feeling strangely empty. That evening, as Madison helped her father with his physical therapy exercises in their small living room, he noticed her distraction. How's he treating you? Thomas asked, lowering his arm after a series of gentle stretches. Fine, Madison said, adjusting the pillow behind his back. He's, professional. Professional. Thomas chuckled, but there was concern in his eyes. Madison, I know Jackson Blackwood. I've been driving him for 23 years. Professional is what he shows the world. But I've seen him when he thinks no one is watching. He's not just professional. He's lonely. Madison felt her cheeks warm. Dad, I'm just filling in until you're better. It's not like he barely talks to me. Sometimes the things we don't say are the most important of all, Thomas said gently. And sometimes the people who need us most are the ones who've forgotten how to ask for help. That night, Madison lay awake thinking about her father's words. She thought about Jackson's surprise when she'd brought him coffee, the way his expression had softened when she'd mentioned Giuseppe's kindness, the moment when he'd asked her to leave the music playing. Small gestures, tiny cracks in his armor, tiny. But what did it matter? In a few weeks, she'd be back to her old life, and Jackson Blackwood would be nothing more than a story she'd tell. The lonely millionaire she'd driven for a brief moment in time. She had no way of knowing that 2 floors below, in the penthouse apartment across the city, Jackson Blackwood was lying awake too, thinking about the woman who had brought him coffee without being asked, who had somehow made his morning commute feel less like a chore and more like coming home. The morning that everything changed started with rain. Madison sat in the Mercedes outside Jackson's building, watching the drops streak down the windshield in the gray pre-dawn light. She'd been driving for him for 2 weeks now, and their routine had settled into something that felt almost comfortable. The coffee from Giuseppe's had become a daily ritual. the classical music a given, and the silence between them had transformed from awkward to companionable. But today felt different. Today Jackson emerged from the elevator looking less composed than usual. His tie was slightly askew, and there were shadows under his eyes that spoke of a sleepless night. "Good morning, Mr. Blackwood," Madison said as she held the door open, offering him the familiar paper cup. "Morning," he replied, but his voice lacked its usual crisp authority. He settled into the back seat with a heaviness that made Madison glance at him in the rearview mirror. As they pulled into traffic, she noticed he wasn't on his phone, a first in the 2 weeks she'd been driving him. Instead, he was staring out the window, watching the city wake up through the veil of rain. "Everything all right, sir?" The question slipped out before Madison could stop herself. Jackson's eyes met hers in the mirror. "Just a long night." Madison nodded, returning her attention to the road. But something in his tone, a crack in the usual armor, made her speak again. "Sometimes my father would tell me that the hardest decisions are the ones we make when we're alone," she said softly. "He said that's when we find out who we really are." Jackson was quiet for so long that Madison wondered if she'd overstepped. Then, unexpectedly, he spoke. "Your father sounds like a wise man." "He is. He taught me that kindness isn't weakness, and that sometimes the strongest thing you can do is ask for help. And what if you've forgotten how to ask?" The vulnerability in his voice made Madison's chest tighten. She took a chance, making a decision that would have terrified her 2 weeks ago. "Would you like to take a different route this morning?" she asked. "I know a way that's quieter. Takes a few minutes longer, but sometimes the longer road is the one that actually gets you where you need to go." Jackson considered this, then nodded. "Show me." Madison turned off the main avenue and guided the car through the tree-lined streets of Central Park. The rain had softened to a gentle mist, and the world outside seemed hushed, peaceful. She drove slowly, letting the morning unfold around them. "I fired 3 people yesterday," Jackson said suddenly. Madison's hands tightened on the steering wheel, but she kept her voice steady. "That must have been difficult." "It was necessary. The quarterly reports were disappointing. Someone had to be held accountable. But that doesn't make it easier." Jackson looked at her in the mirror, surprised by her understanding. "No, it doesn't." They drove in silence for a few minutes, the only sound the gentle patter of rain on the roof and the soft classical music from the radio. Madison found herself stealing glances at Jackson, seeing something in his expression she'd never noticed before. Loneliness, yes, but also a kind of exhaustion that went deeper than missed sleep. "May I ask you something?" Jackson said as they approached the park's exit. "Of course. Why are you doing this? Really? You could have found another job, left your father's work to someone else. Why step into this world?" Madison considered her answer carefully. "Because sometimes we don't choose our responsibilities. They choose us. My father gave 23 years of his life to your family. That means something. It means I don't walk away when things get hard. Even when it's temporary?" The question hung in the air between them, loaded with meaning that neither of them was ready to acknowledge. "Even then," Madison said quietly. As they pulled up to Jackson's office building, he made no move to get out. Instead, he leaned forward slightly, closing the distance between them. "Madison," he said, and her name sounded different in his voice, softer, more personal. "Would you mind if we took the park route again tomorrow?" Their eyes met in the mirror, and Madison felt something shift inside her chest. "I'd like that." Jackson smiled then. A real smile, not the polished expression he wore for business meetings. It transformed his entire face, making him look younger, more approachable. "Good," he said. "That's good." The rest of the day passed in a blur for Madison. She ran errands, visited her father, helped him with his physical therapy. But her mind kept returning to the conversation in the car, to the way Jackson had looked at her when he smiled, to the warmth that had spread through her when he'd said her name. That evening, as she prepared for her night shift at the hospital, her father noticed her distraction. "You're different," Thomas said, watching her pack her lunch. "Lighter somehow." "I'm fine, Dad." "Madison." His voice was gentle but firm. "I know you better than that." "What's happening?" She sat down across from him, suddenly needing to talk to someone who would understand. "I think I'm getting attached," she admitted. "To the job, to the routine, to—" She trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. "To him," Thomas said quietly. Madison nodded, feeling tears prick at her eyes. "I know it's stupid. I know it's temporary. But Dad, when he looks at me, it's like he sees me, really sees me. and I've never felt that before. Thomas reached across the table and took her hand. Sweetheart, there's nothing stupid about connecting with someone, but you need to be careful. Jackson Blackwood lives in a different world than we do. I know that. Do you? Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you're both forgetting that this arrangement has an expiration date. Madison pulled her hand away, suddenly defensive. Nothing's going to happen, Dad. We're just two people who happen to share a car for a few hours each day. But even as she said the words, Madison knew they weren't true. Something was happening between her and Jackson. Something that grew stronger with each shared glance, each moment of comfortable silence, each small gesture of kindness. And as she drove through the rainy night to her shift at the hospital, Madison couldn't shake the feeling that she was standing at the edge of something that would change her life forever. She just wasn't sure if she was brave enough to jump. Madison knew something was different the moment Jackson got into the car that Friday morning. He wasn't on his phone. He wasn't carrying his usual stack of documents. And when she offered him his coffee, he accepted it with a smile that seemed to carry a secret. "Good morning, Madison," he said, settling into the back seat. "Beautiful day, isn't it?" She glanced at the overcast sky through the windshield. "It looks like it might rain again, Mr. Blackwood." "Does it?" Jackson's eyes met hers in the rearview mirror, and there was something playful in his expression that she'd never seen before. "I hadn't noticed." As they drove through the park, their route now, she realized with a flutter in her chest, Jackson broke their comfortable silence. "Tell me something about yourself," he said. "Something your father wouldn't have mentioned." Madison's hands tightened on the steering wheel. "What would you like to know?" "Anything." "Everything." He paused. "What did you want to be when you were a child?" The question caught her off guard. "A teacher," she said without thinking. "I wanted to teach elementary school. I used to line up my stuffed animals and give them lessons on everything from math to proper table manners." Jackson's quiet laugh made her smile. "What changed?" "Life," Madison said simply. "Dad worked 2 jobs to keep us afloat after my mom died. College wasn't really an option, but I still read to the kids when I have time during my hospital shifts. The pediatric ward has a small library. You work at a hospital? Memorial General. Night shifts mostly, in the general services department. It's not glamorous, but it pays the bills." She caught his expression in the mirror. "Not everyone gets to build empires, Mr. Blackwood. Some of us just try to keep the world running." "Jackson," he said quietly. "What?" "My name is Jackson, and you're wrong about one thing. What you do is far more important than what I do. I move money around. You take care of people." Madison felt her cheeks warm. "I just empty trash cans and mop floors. In a place where people come to heal, where families wait for miracles, where children need someone to read them stories." Jackson leaned forward slightly. "Don't diminish what you do, Madison. The world needs more people like you." They had reached his office building, but Jackson made no move to get out. Instead, he sat there looking at her with an intensity that made her heart race. "I have a confession," he said finally. "Sir?" "Jackson," he corrected gently. "And my confession is this. I cleared my schedule for today." Madison blinked. "I'm sorry?" "No meetings, no conference calls, no board presentations." He paused. "I was wondering if you might show me some of the places you love in this city. The real places, not the ones in my world." Madison's mouth went dry. You want me to spend the day with me, as Madison Parker, not as my driver, if you'd like to." The rational part of her mind screamed warnings. This was crossing every line, breaking every rule of professional conduct. Her father would be horrified. The temporary nature of their arrangement made this dangerous in ways she couldn't even fully comprehend. But when she looked at Jackson, really looked at him, she saw something she recognized. Loneliness. A desperate need for connection, for something real in a world that seemed built on artifice and transaction. "I get off my hospital shift at 7 in the morning," she heard herself say. "I usually stop at a diner on my way home. Nothing fancy, just a place where the coffee's strong and the pancakes are real." "I'd like that," Jackson said, and his smile was like sunrise breaking through clouds. "Where should I meet you?" "Mel's Diner on 42nd Street, but Jackson," she used his name deliberately, watching how it affected him. "Are you sure about this? Your world and mine?" "Forget about worlds," he said, his voice suddenly fierce. "For one day, let's just be 2 people who enjoy each other's company." 4 hours later, Madison found herself sitting across from Jackson Blackwood in a cracked vinyl booth at Mel's Diner, watching him attempt to eat a stack of blueberry pancakes that were probably worth more than his usual breakfast budget. He'd traded his expensive suit for jeans and a simple button-down shirt, and somehow the casual clothes made him seem more approachable, more human. His hair was slightly mussed from the October wind, and there was a lightness in his expression that transformed his entire face. "These are incredible," he said, taking another bite. "When was the last time I had pancakes?" "You don't remember?" "I don't think I've ever had pancakes like this. My usual breakfast is a protein bar eaten in the car." He looked around the diner, at the worn countertops, the mismatched coffee mugs, the waitress who called everyone honey, with genuine curiosity. "How did you find this place?" "My dad brought me here when I was 12. I'd had a terrible day at school. Some kids were making fun of my shoes, which were from a thrift store. Dad said that real value isn't about what things cost. It's about how they make you feel." Madison smiled at the memory. "Mel makes the best comfort food in the city, and she's never met a person she couldn't make feel welcome." Jackson nodded, understanding. "Your father taught you a lot about what matters?" "He did. What about you? What did your father teach you?" Something shifted in Jackson's expression. "That the world is divided into those who have power and those who don't. That emotion is weakness. That the only thing you can trust is success." He paused. "I'm starting to think he might have been wrong about a few things." "What changed your mind?" Jackson looked directly at her, his blue eyes serious. "You did." The words hung between them, loaded with meaning that neither of them was quite ready to explore. Madison felt her breath catch, and for a moment, the busy diner faded away until there was nothing but Jackson's steady gaze and the rapid beating of her heart. "Madison," he said softly, and she loved the way her name sounded in his voice. "I need you to know something." "What?" "These past 3 weeks, they've been the best part of my days. Not just the drives, but the conversations, the coffee, the way you see the world. You've reminded me that there's more to life than quarterly reports and board meetings." Madison felt tears prick at her eyes. "Jackson, I know this is complicated. I know we come from different places. But I also know that when I'm with you, I feel more like myself than I have in years." Before Madison could respond, her phone buzzed with a text message. Her heart sank as she read it. "What is it?" Jackson asked, noticing her expression. "It's from my dad. The doctor cleared him to return to work next week." She looked up at Jackson, and the pain in her eyes was unmistakable. "My time as your driver is almost over." Jackson reached across the table and covered her hand with his. The touch sent electricity racing up her arm. "Then we need to make the most of the time we have left," he said quietly. And as Madison looked into his eyes, she realized she was falling for a man she would have to leave behind. Madison stared at her phone for the third time in 10 minutes, reading Jackson's text message over and over. "Would you like to spend Saturday together? No agenda, no schedule, just us." She was sitting in her father's hospital room. He'd been readmitted for routine tests, watching him sleep peacefully. The doctor said his recovery was remarkable, ahead of schedule. By Monday, he'd be cleared to resume all normal activities, including driving Jackson Blackwood. Her phone buzzed with another message. "I know I'm overstepping, but I can't stop thinking about what you said at the diner, about making the most of our time." Madison's chest tightened. In the 4 days since their breakfast at Mel's, something had fundamentally shifted between them. The professional distance they'd maintained was crumbling, replaced by stolen glances, lingering conversations, and a tension that hummed in the space between them. Yesterday, when she'd dropped him off at his office, Jackson had hesitated before getting out of the car. "Madison," he'd said, his voice soft, "what we're doing, what's happening between us. I know," she'd whispered. "I know it's complicated. It's more than complicated. It's impossible." But even as he'd said the words, his eyes had told a different story. Now staring at his text, Madison made a decision that terrified and exhilarated her in equal measure. "Yes, I'd like that very much." Saturday morning found Madison standing outside a small bookstore in Greenwich Village wearing her best dress, a simple blue sundress that brought out her eyes, and feeling more nervous than she had since her first day driving for Jackson. When she saw him approaching from down the street, her breath caught. He looked different in weekend clothes. Relaxed jeans, a soft gray sweater, and sneakers that probably cost more than her monthly rent, but somehow made him seem more accessible, more real. "You're early," he said when he reached her, but his smile took any criticism out of the words. "So are you." "I've been walking around the block for 20 minutes, Jackson admitted. "I was nervous." The honesty in his confession made Madison's heart flutter. "You? Nervous?" "Terrified," he said simply. "I've built a career on being in control, having all the answers. But with you, I feel like I'm learning a completely new language." Madison looked up at him, seeing the vulnerability he was trying so hard to hide. What language is that? The language of being myself. They spent the morning wandering through the bookstore, and Madison discovered that Jackson was nothing like the cold businessman she'd imagined. He loved poetry, Neruda and Rumi, and had read every mystery novel written by Agatha Christie. He bought her a collection of short stories by Alice Munro, and when she protested that it was too expensive, he said quietly, "Let me do this, please." From there, they walked through Washington Square Park, sharing stories about their childhoods. Jackson told her about growing up in boarding schools, about holidays spent with nannies instead of parents, about learning early that affection was something you earned through achievement. Madison shared memories of Sunday mornings with her father, making pancakes and reading the comics together. She told him about her mother who had died when Madison was 15, and how her father had become both parents to her. "He sounds extraordinary," Jackson said as they sat on a bench watching street performers entertain a small crowd. "He is, but he worries about me. He thinks I don't take enough risks, don't put myself out there." Madison glanced at Jackson. "I guess he'd be surprised to see me now. Would he approve of this?" Madison considered the question. "He'd want me to be happy, but he'd also worry about me getting hurt." "I don't want to hurt you," Jackson said, his voice serious. "I know, but we both know this can't last. Next week, you'll go back to your life and I'll go back to mine." Jackson turned to face her fully. "What if it didn't have to be that way?" "Jackson, I'm serious. What if we figured out a way to make this work?" Madison felt her heart race, but she forced herself to be realistic. "How? You live in penthouses and I live in a one-bedroom apartment with my father. You attend galas and I work night shifts at a hospital. We're from different worlds. So we're Romeo and Juliet. And look how that ended," Madison said, but she was smiling despite herself. Jackson laughed, and the sound was warm and genuine. "Fair point, but maybe we can write a better ending." They had lunch at a tiny Italian restaurant where the owner's grandmother made pasta by hand in the front window. Jackson was fascinated by everything: the way the servers knew regular customers by name, the mismatched plates, the framed family photos covering every wall. "I've eaten at the most expensive restaurants in the city," he said, twirling spaghetti on his fork. "But I've never tasted anything this good." "That's because it's made with love," Madison said. "My mom used to say that was the secret ingredient in all the best food." "Tell me about her." Madison spoke about her mother for the first time in years, about her laugh, her terrible singing voice, the way she'd dance in the kitchen while making dinner. Jackson listened with the kind of attention that made Madison feel like every word mattered. "She would have liked you," Madison said finally. "Why?" "Because you listen, really listen, and because you make me laugh." As the afternoon turned to evening, they found themselves back in Central Park, walking along the same paths Madison had driven Jackson through countless times, but everything looked different from ground level, more intimate, more real. "I have a confession," Jackson said as they paused beside the lake. "Another one? I've been taking the long way to work every morning for 2 weeks. Not because of traffic, because I wanted more time with you." Madison's breath caught. "Jackson, I know it's selfish. I know it complicates things. But Madison, these past few weeks have been the happiest I've been in years. Maybe ever." Before she could respond, he stepped closer, close enough that she could see the flecks of gold in his blue eyes. "May I kiss you?" he asked softly. Madison's rational mind screamed warnings, but her heart was already answering. She nodded, and when Jackson's lips touched hers, the rest of the world disappeared. The kiss was gentle at first, tentative, as if Jackson was afraid she might disappear. But when Madison's arms wound around his neck, he pulled her closer, and the kiss deepened into something that spoke of longing, of connection, of possibilities neither of them had dared to imagine. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard. "Madison," Jackson whispered against her forehead, "I think I'm falling in love with you." The words should have terrified her. Instead, they felt like coming home. "I think I'm falling in love with you too," she whispered back. But even as they held each other in the gathering dusk, both knew that love might not be enough to bridge the gap between their worlds. And Monday morning was only 36 hours away. Monday morning arrived like a funeral bell. Madison sat in the Mercedes outside Jackson's building, her hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles had turned white. This was it, her final day as his driver. Tomorrow her father would be back behind this wheel, and she would return to her life of night shifts and medical bills and the quiet anonymity she'd lived in before Jackson Blackwood had looked at her in a rearview mirror and changed everything. The weekend felt like a dream now. Had she really spent Saturday walking through bookstores with him? Had they really kissed beside the lake in Central Park? Had he really whispered that he was falling in love with her? Her phone buzzed with a text from her father. Feeling great today. Ready to get back to work tomorrow. Thank you for everything, sweetheart. Madison closed her eyes, fighting back tears. She should be happy for him. She should be relieved that her temporary responsibility was ending. Instead, she felt like her heart was being ripped from her chest. The elevator chimed and Jackson emerged. But something was wrong. His usual composed expression was replaced by something that looked almost panicked. When their eyes met through the windshield, Madison saw her own anguish reflected back at her. "Good morning," she said as he approached the car, but her voice came out strained. "Madison." He stopped beside the open door, making no move to get in. "We need to talk." "Sir, we should—" "Don't." His voice was sharp. "Don't call me sir, not today." Madison's chest tightened. "Jackson, please get in the car, you'll be late." "I don't care about being late." But he slid into the back seat anyway, and Madison noticed he didn't have his usual coffee, didn't have his phone out, didn't have any of the props that normally defined their morning routine. As they pulled into traffic, the silence between them was deafening. Madison found herself taking the long route through the park without being asked, desperate to stretch out these final moments. "I didn't sleep last night," Jackson said suddenly. Madison glanced at him in the mirror. "Neither did I. I kept thinking about what happens tomorrow, about going back to the way things were before. You'll have your regular driver back. Everything will return to normal." "Normal?" Jackson laughed, but there was no humor in it. "I don't even remember what normal felt like before you." Madison's hands trembled on the steering wheel. "Jackson, please don't make this harder than it already is." "Harder? Madison, this is killing me." He leaned forward, his voice urgent. "Do you know what it's like to find something real in a world full of fakeness only to have it taken away? You think this is easy for me?" Madison's voice cracked. "You think I want to go back to being invisible? To pretending that these past few weeks didn't happen? Then don't. Stay." Madison pulled over to the side of the road, her vision blurring with tears. They were in a quiet spot near the reservoir, the early morning joggers providing the only movement in an otherwise still world. "Stay how?" she asked, turning to face him. "As what? Your employee? What would people call me, Jackson? What would your business associates say when you showed up to charity galas with the help?" Jackson flinched as if she'd slapped him. "You're not the help, aren't I? My father spent 23 years driving you around and you never even knew his daughter existed until 3 weeks ago. What makes you think I could ever truly fit into your world?" "Because I love you," Jackson said, the words torn from somewhere deep in his chest. "Because when I'm with you, I don't care about my world. I care about building something new, something real, something that's ours." Madison's tears spilled over. "And what happens when the novelty wears off? When you realize that I don't know which fork to use at fancy dinners? When your friends start whispering about how you're slumming it with the driver's daughter? You think so little of me? You think I care about any of that? I think you live in a bubble, and you don't understand what it's like for people like me to exist in your world. I think you're romanticizing something that could never work in reality." Jackson was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice was deadly calm. "Maybe you're right. Maybe I am naive. Maybe I don't understand your world any better than you understand mine." Madison wiped her eyes, trying to compose herself. "We should go. You're already late." "Madison, please, Jackson. Let's just finish this with some dignity." The rest of the drive passed in painful silence. When they reached his office building, Jackson sat in the back seat for a full minute before speaking. "Will you do something for me?" he asked quietly. "What? Will you have dinner with me tonight? One last time?" Madison's heart clenched. "Jackson, please. I know we can't figure everything out in one night, but I can't bear the thought of this ending with an argument. Give me one more evening to tell you what you mean to me." Madison closed her eyes, knowing she should say no, knowing that prolonging this would only make it worse. But when she opened them and saw the desperate hope in his expression, she couldn't bring herself to crush it. "All right," she whispered, "one last dinner." Jackson's smile was heartbreaking in its gratitude. "Thank you." As he walked toward his building, Madison watched him go, memorizing the way he moved, the set of his shoulders, the way he turned back once to look at her before disappearing through the glass doors. That evening, as Madison prepared for what she knew would be their goodbye dinner, her father knocked on her bedroom door. "You look beautiful, sweetheart," Thomas said, taking in her simple black dress and the way she'd styled her hair. "Thank you." Madison. His voice was gentle. I know this is hard, but sometimes the kindest thing we can do for someone we love is let them go. Madison met her father's eyes in the mirror. What if I don't want to be kind? What if I want to be selfish for once in my life? Thomas was quiet for a moment. Then you follow your heart, but remember, love isn't just about what we want. It's about what's best for the other person too. As Madison left for her final evening with Jackson, she carried her father's words with her like a weight on her chest. She had no idea that across town, Jackson was having a very similar conversation with his reflection, asking himself the same impossible question. How do you let go of the person who's taught you what it means to be alive? Tonight would either save them or destroy them completely, and neither of them knew which outcome they were more afraid of. Chapter 7. The Dinner That Changed Their Hearts. Madison expected Jackson to choose an expensive restaurant where crystal glasses caught the light and servers spoke in hushed, reverent tones. Instead, she found herself standing outside Giuseppe's cafe, the same small place where she'd bought Jackson's first cup of coffee all those weeks ago. Jackson was waiting for her on the sidewalk, and for a moment, they simply looked at each other. He'd traded his usual expensive suits for dark jeans and a simple white button-down, but it was his expression that took her breath away. Vulnerable, hopeful, and tinged with the kind of desperation that came from knowing you were about to lose something precious. Giuseppe closes at 8, Jackson said softly, but he agreed to stay open just for us. Madison's throat tightened. You asked him to do that. I told him about you, about us, about how this was the place where everything started to change for me. Jackson stepped closer, close enough that she could smell his cologne, something clean and understated. He said any woman who could get me to appreciate real coffee deserved a proper goodbye dinner. Before Madison could respond, Giuseppe himself emerged from the cafe, his weathered face breaking into a warm smile. Ah, la bella Madison, he exclaimed, embracing her like an old friend. And Jackson, my boy, come, come. I have prepared something special. Inside, the small cafe had been transformed. Candles flickered on a single table set for two, and the usual harsh fluorescent lighting had been replaced with the warm glow of string lights Giuseppe had hung just for them. The aroma of fresh pasta and herbs filled the air. Giuseppe, Madison whispered, tears pricking her eyes. This is beautiful. The older man beamed with pride. Love deserves beauty, no? Now sit, both of you. Tonight you are family. As Giuseppe bustled around them, serving homemade ravioli and pouring wine from a bottle he claimed had been saving for a special occasion, Jackson and Madison sat across from each other in a bubble of intimate silence. This morning, Madison began carefully, what we said to each other was the truth. Jackson finished. At least my part was. I do love you, Madison. I love your strength, your kindness, the way you see beauty in places I never thought to look. I love that you brought me coffee because you thought I might be lonely, not because you wanted something from me. Madison's chest ached. Jackson, but you were right too, about the differences between our worlds, about how naive I've been. He reached across the table, his fingers brushing against hers. I've spent the entire day thinking about what you said, and I realized something. What? I don't want you to fit into my world. I want to find a way to exist in yours. Madison stared at him, confused. What do you mean? Jackson took a deep breath as if he were about to jump off a cliff. I mean, I've been doing this all wrong. I've been thinking about how to make you part of my life, when what I should be thinking about is how to build a life that's worthy of you. Jackson, I don't understand. My company, he said quietly. It's successful, yes, but it's also empty, soulless. I spend my days moving money around, making rich people richer. When was the last time I did something that actually mattered? Madison's heart began to race. What are you saying? I'm saying maybe it's time for me to figure out what I actually want to do with my life, instead of just what I'm expected to do. Jackson's eyes were bright with something Madison had never seen before. Hope. I'm saying maybe I want to find work that feeds my soul the way yours does. Maybe I want to build something that helps people instead of just helping myself. That's a beautiful thought, but Jackson, you can't just change your entire life because of me. Why not? His grip on her hand tightened. Madison, before I met you, I was sleepwalking through my days, going through the motions of a life that looked successful from the outside but felt hollow on the inside. You woke me up. You showed me what it felt like to be truly alive. Tears spilled down Madison's cheeks. But what if it doesn't work? What if you give up everything and then realize you've made a mistake? Then at least I'll have tried. At least I'll have chosen love over fear. Jackson brought her hand to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss to her knuckles. Madison, I would rather fail at building something real with you than succeed at living a lie without you. Giuseppe appeared at their table, setting down a plate of his famous tiramisu. Ah, he said, noticing Madison's tears. The heart speaks loudly tonight, yes? Giuseppe, Jackson said suddenly. Can I ask you something? Of course, my boy. How did you know when you met your wife that she was the one? Giuseppe's eyes grew soft with memory. Ah, la mia cara Lucia. You know what told me she was the one? It was not the big moments, Jackson. It was the small ones. The way she laughed at my terrible jokes. The way she made me want to be a better man. The way the world felt more colorful when she was in it. He patted Jackson's shoulder. Love is not about finding someone who fits into your life perfectly. Love is about finding someone who makes you want to rebuild your life entirely, from the foundation up. Madison and Jackson looked at each other across the candlelit table, Giuseppe's words hanging in the air between them. Madison, Jackson said softly, I know I'm asking for something impossible. I know I'm asking you to take a leap of faith with a man who's still figuring out who he wants to be. But I'm also promising you something. What? That I will spend every day trying to be worthy of the love you've shown me. That I will build a life that honors both of us. That I will never ever make you feel like you have to change who you are to be with me. Madison closed her eyes, feeling the weight of the decision before her. When she opened them, Jackson was watching her with an expression of such tender vulnerability that it took her breath away. I'm scared, she whispered. So am I, Jackson admitted. But Madison, I've never been more sure of anything in my life. We belong together. I don't know how we'll make it work, but I know we're supposed to try. Madison looked around the small cafe, at Giuseppe humming in the kitchen, at the candles flickering on their table, at the man sitting across from her who had somehow learned to see her the way she'd always dreamed of being seen. Maybe her father was right. Maybe love wasn't just about what you wanted, but about what was best for both people. And maybe, just maybe, what was best for both of them was to be brave enough to believe that love could bridge any gap. Okay, she whispered. Jackson's eyes widened. Okay? Okay, Madison said more firmly. Let's try. Let's be brave. Let's see if we can build something beautiful together. Jackson's smile was radiant as he reached across the table and cupped her face in his hands. I love you, Madison Parker, he said, and I promise you won't regret giving us a chance. But as they sat there in Giuseppe's cafe, holding hands across a table lit by candles and dreams, neither of them could have imagined the challenges that lay ahead, or the strength they would find in facing them together. 3 weeks after their dinner at Giuseppe's, Madison discovered that loving Jackson Blackwood was the easy part. Living in his world, however, was proving to be infinitely more complicated. She stood in front of the mirror in her tiny apartment, adjusting the neckline of a dress that had cost more than she used to make in a month. Jackson had bought it for her, along with shoes, jewelry, and a handbag that the salesperson had described as essential for tonight's charity gala. Madison barely recognized herself. You look beautiful, sweetheart, her father said from the doorway, but she could hear the concern in his voice. I look like I'm playing dress-up, Madison replied, smoothing down the expensive fabric. Dad, what if I say the wrong thing? What if I use the wrong fork or talk to the wrong person? Thomas stepped into the room and placed his hands on her shoulders. Madison, listen to me. You are intelligent, kind, and strong. You have nothing to be ashamed of. Easy for you to say. You're not the one who has to make small talk with people who think poverty is a character flaw. Her father's expression grew serious. Is that what Jackson thinks? No. Madison's voice softened. No, he's been wonderful, patient, understanding. It's everyone else I'm worried about. The truth was, the past 3 weeks had been a whirlwind of adjustments. Jackson had been true to his word. He'd started making changes to his life, stepping back from some of the more ruthless aspects of his business, exploring philanthropic opportunities that aligned with his newfound values. But those changes took time, and in the meantime, Madison found herself thrust into a world where her background was scrutinized, her every word analyzed, and her relationship with Jackson viewed as either a fascinating curiosity or a scandalous misstep. The doorbell rang and Madison's stomach dropped. That's him, she said, suddenly feeling sick. Madison, her father caught her hand. Remember who you are. Remember what you bring to his life. And remember that if these people can't see your worth, that says everything about them and nothing about you. Jackson was waiting in the hallway, devastatingly handsome in his black tuxedo. But when he saw Madison, his expression shifted from polite anticipation to something much deeper. "You're stunning," he said softly, his eyes drinking her in. "I feel like a fraud," Madison admitted. Jackson stepped closer, cupping her face in his hands. "You could never be a fraud. You're the most authentic person I know. Jackson, what if tonight is a disaster? What if I embarrass you?" "Madison," his voice was firm. "Look at me. You could never embarrass me. If anyone makes you feel unwelcome tonight, we leave. Immediately. No questions asked." The gala was being held at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and as their car pulled up to the red-carpeted entrance, Madison felt her anxiety spike. Photographers lined the walkway, and elegantly dressed guests swept up the steps like they owned the world. "Remember," Jackson murmured in her ear as they stepped out of the car, "we're a team, you and me against the world if necessary." But Madison's confidence wavered the moment they entered the museum. The other guests moved through the space with an easy familiarity that spoke of generations of privilege. Their conversations were peppered with references to private islands, art collections, and social connections that Madison couldn't even begin to understand. "Jackson," a woman in a sparkling silver gown approached them, her smile sharp as a blade. "How wonderful to see you. And this must be your friend." Madison felt the pause before the word friend, felt the way the woman's eyes catalogued her appearance, searching for flaws. "Vivian, I'd like you to meet Madison Parker," Jackson said smoothly. "Madison, this is Vivian Hartwell. She's on the board of the Children's Hospital Foundation." "How nice," Vivian said, her tone suggesting it was anything but. "And what do you do, Madison?" "I work at Memorial General Hospital," Madison replied, lifting her chin. "Oh, are you a doctor? A nurse?" "I'm in general services." The silence that followed felt deafening. Madison watched as Vivian's expression shifted from polite curiosity to barely concealed disdain. "How interesting," Vivian said finally. "Jackson, you always were one for unique experiences." Madison felt her cheeks burn, but before she could respond, Jackson's arm tightened around her waist. "Madison is the most remarkable woman I've ever met," he said, his voice carrying a warning that made Vivian's smile falter. "She works harder than most people in this room ever have, and she does it with a grace and dignity that puts the rest of us to shame." "Of course," Vivian said quickly. "I didn't mean to imply—" "Yes, you did," Jackson said quietly. "Excuse us." As they walked away, Madison felt both grateful for Jackson's defense and humiliated that she'd needed defending at all. "I'm sorry," Jackson said when they were out of earshot. She's old money, old attitudes. Not everyone here is like that." But as the evening progressed, Madison discovered that while not everyone was as openly hostile as Vivian, the message was clear. She didn't belong. The conversation stopped when she approached. The smiles were polite but distant. When she mentioned her work at the hospital, people nodded with the kind of forced interest usually reserved for discussing the weather. By the time they sat down for dinner, Madison felt emotionally exhausted. "Are you all right?" Jackson asked quietly, leaning toward her. "I'm fine," Madison lied, but her voice was tight. The final straw came during the auction. As bidding opened on a painting, the woman next to Madison, a banker's wife, turned to her with a condescending smile. "I suppose this must all seem very overwhelming to you," she said. "All this money being thrown around for a single piece of art." Madison felt something snap inside her. "Actually," she said, her voice calm but steady, "I think it's beautiful that people are willing to spend so much to support the children's cancer ward. Last month, I watched a 7-year-old girl die because her family couldn't afford experimental treatment. So no, I don't think $30,000 for a painting is overwhelming. I think it's necessary." The woman's face went pale, and several people at nearby tables turned to stare. I didn't mean," the woman stammered. "I know exactly what you meant," Madison said, standing up. "Excuse me." She walked toward the museum's main hall, needing air, needing space, needing to remember who she was beneath all the expensive fabric and borrowed jewelry. Jackson found her standing in front of a painting of a woman in simple clothes, her expression serene and dignified. "Madison," he said softly. "I can't do this," she said without turning around. "I thought I could, but I can't. They look at me like I'm some kind of charity case you've taken on, like I'm a project or a phase you're going through." Jackson moved to stand beside her. "I'm sorry. I should have prepared you better. I should have—" "No, Jackson, this isn't your fault, but it's also not sustainable." Madison finally looked at him, and Jackson saw the pain in her eyes. I love you. God help me, I love you more than I thought possible. But I can't spend the rest of my life proving that I'm worthy of being in the same room as you. Madison, please. It will get better. People will adjust. Will they? Or will I just learn to pretend that their condescension doesn't hurt? Madison shook her head. I don't want to become someone who's okay with being looked down on. I don't want to lose myself trying to fit into a world that doesn't want me. Jackson was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice was raw with emotion. Then maybe, he said slowly, it's time I stopped trying to make you fit into my world and started figuring out how to step into yours. Madison turned to stare at him. What are you saying? I'm saying maybe Giuseppe was right. Maybe love isn't about finding someone who fits into your life perfectly. Maybe it's about being willing to rebuild your life entirely. Jackson, marry me, he said suddenly, the words tumbling out with desperate urgency. Marry me, Madison. Not so you can become part of my world, but so we can create our own world. Together. Madison's breath caught. Jackson, we've only been together for 3 weeks. I've known you for over a month. I've watched you care for your father, work double shifts, bring coffee to a stranger because you thought he looked lonely. I've seen your strength, your kindness, your incredible heart. I don't need more time to know that I want to spend the rest of my life with you. Around them, the elegant crowd continued their conversations, oblivious to the life-changing moment happening in their midst. What are you really asking me? Madison whispered. I'm asking you to trust me, to trust us, to believe that love can be stronger than social conventions and stronger than other people's expectations. Jackson took her hands in his. I'm asking you to marry me not because I want to change you, but because I can't imagine a future without you in it. Madison looked into his eyes and saw not the polished businessman who had first stepped into her father's car, but the man who had learned to see the world through her eyes, who had fallen in love not with what she could become, but with who she already was. Yes, she whispered, tears streaming down her face. Yes, Jackson, I'll marry you. But even as Jackson pulled her into his arms, even as he kissed her with all the joy and relief in his heart, Madison couldn't shake the feeling that saying yes was the easy part. Making it work would be the real challenge. 2 months before their wedding, Madison discovered that planning a life together was far more complicated than falling in love. She sat in Jackson's penthouse office, surrounded by wedding planners, caterers, and florists, feeling increasingly disconnected from the elaborate celebration being planned around her. Everything was beautiful, everything was expensive, and everything felt wrong. The orchids would be stunning for the centerpieces, the wedding planner Cordelia Ashworth was saying as she flipped through a thick portfolio. Very elegant, very sophisticated, perfect for the Plaza Ballroom. Madison glanced at Jackson, who was reviewing contracts with the same intensity he brought to business deals. In the 2 months since their engagement, he'd thrown himself into wedding planning with characteristic determination, as if the perfect celebration could somehow smooth over all the complications their relationship faced. Actually, Madison said quietly, I was thinking about something simpler. Maybe wildflowers? And instead of the plaza, what about somewhere outdoors? Cordelia's smile became strained. Outdoor weddings can be so unpredictable. Weather, lighting, acoustics. For a couple of your prominence, I really think a more traditional venue would be appropriate. Madison felt the familiar sting of being patronized, but before she could respond, Jackson looked up from his papers. What did you have in mind? He asked, his attention fully focused on her for the first time all morning. I don't know, Madison admitted. Something that feels like us, not like a performance for people who barely know us. Cordelia cleared her throat. Mr. Blackwood, surely you understand the importance of making the right impression. Your business associates, your social circle, they'll expect a certain level of spectacle, Madison finished, her voice sharp. Sophistication, Cordelia corrected, but her meaning was clear. After the wedding planners left, Madison and Jackson sat alone in his office, the silence heavy between them. You hate all of this, Jackson said finally. I don't hate it. I don't understand why we need to prove our love to 300 people who don't even care about us. Jackson moved to sit beside her on the couch. Madison, I want to give you the wedding you deserve. Something beautiful, something memorable. What I deserve is a wedding that feels real. What I deserve is to marry the man I fell in love with, not the version of you that feels obligated to impress people who made me feel worthless at that gala. Jackson was quiet for a long moment. You're right, he said finally. I've been so focused on doing this correctly that I forgot what actually matters. What matters? You, me, the promise we're making to each other. Jackson took her hands. Tell me what you really want. Madison's eyes filled with tears. I want my father to walk me down the aisle. I want to marry you somewhere that means something to us. I want Giuseppe to cater the dinner with his incredible pasta. I want it to be about love, not about proving that we belong together. Then that's what we'll have, Jackson said without hesitation. But their problems went deeper than wedding planning. The following week, Madison was working her shift at the hospital when Dr. Morrison, the head of general services, called her into his office. Madison, he said, his expression uncomfortable. We need to talk. Madison's stomach dropped. Is something wrong? I've been getting inquiries. About you? About your relationship with Jackson Blackwood. What kind of inquiries? Dr. Morrison sighed. Look, Madison, you're a good employee, reliable, hardworking, but this situation is putting the hospital in an awkward position. Mr. Blackwood's company has significant contracts with us. People are starting to whisper about conflicts of interest, about whether your relationship might affect our business dealings. Madison felt the blood drain from her face. Are you firing me? I'm suggesting that perhaps it's time for you to move on. Find something more suitable. Mr. Blackwood certainly has the resources to help you transition to a new career. And if I don't want to transition? If I want to keep the job I've earned through my own hard work? Dr. Morrison's expression grew stern. Madison, be realistic. You're engaged to one of the wealthiest men in the city. Do you really think it's appropriate for you to continue emptying trash cans and mopping floors? That evening, Madison sat in her father's living room, feeling as though her world was crumbling around her. They want me to quit, she told Thomas, her voice hollow. Not because I'm not good at my job, but because apparently being engaged to Jackson makes me inappropriate. Her father set down his coffee cup, his expression thoughtful. What did Jackson say? I haven't told him yet. He's been so stressed about the business changes he's trying to make, the wedding, the pressure from his board of directors. Madison rubbed her temples. Dad, sometimes I wonder if we're fighting a losing battle, if maybe everyone is right and we're just too different. Madison, Thomas's voice was gentle but firm. Do you love him? With all my heart. And does he love you? Yes. But sometimes I wonder if love is enough, if we can really build a life together when the whole world seems determined to tear us apart. Before Thomas could respond, Madison's phone rang. Jackson's name flashed on the screen. Madison? His voice was tense when she answered. We need to talk. Can you come over? What's wrong? My father is in town. Madison's blood went cold. Jackson had mentioned his father only a few times and never with affection. Richard Blackwood was old money, old power, and old prejudices. Jackson had spent years trying to earn his approval and had only recently stopped caring about his father's opinion. He wants to meet you, Jackson continued. And Madison, he knows about your background. He's done research. An hour later, Madison stood in Jackson's penthouse living room, facing a man who looked like an older, colder version of the man she loved. Richard Blackwood was impeccably dressed, perfectly composed, and radiated the kind of quiet authority that came from generations of inherited power. Miss Parker, he said, not bothering to stand when Jackson introduced them. How interesting to finally meet you. Mr. Blackwood, Madison replied, keeping her voice steady despite the obvious insult. Please sit. Richard gestured to a chair across from him as if he were granting an audience. I understand you work at a hospital. I do. And your father drives for my son. He has for 23 years, yes. Richard nodded, as if confirming something unpleasant. I'm sure you're a very nice girl, Miss Parker, but surely you understand that this infatuation can't possibly last. Dad, Jackson started, but Richard held up a hand. Jackson is going through what we might call a rebellious phase. It's not uncommon for men of his age and position to become temporarily fascinated by, let's call it, authentic experiences. Madison felt her cheeks burn, but she kept her voice level. And you think I'm an authentic experience? I think you're a distraction from the responsibilities that come with the Blackwood name. I think you're a young woman who's gotten swept up in a fairy tale that can only end in disappointment for both of you. That's enough, Jackson said, standing up. But Richard wasn't finished. Jackson, your company is at a critical juncture. The decisions you've been making, stepping back from profitable ventures, pursuing these idealistic philanthropic projects, they're already affecting your bottom line. And now this engagement to someone so unsuitable. It's causing concerns among your investors. Concerns? Jackson's voice was dangerously quiet. About your judgment, about your priorities, about whether you're still the man they trust to lead a multi-billion-dollar corporation. Madison watched the color drain from Jackson's face as the implications of his father's words sank in. What are you saying? Jackson asked. I'm saying that if you insist on going through with this marriage, you may find yourself with a wife, but without a company. The board is prepared to call for a vote of no confidence. The silence that followed was deafening. Madison felt as though she were watching Jackson's world crumble in real time, and she was the cause of it. Get out, Jackson said finally, his voice barely controlled. Jackson, get out of my home now. After Richard left, Jackson slumped onto the couch, his head in his hands. He's bluffing, Madison said, though her voice lacked conviction. No, Jackson said quietly. He's not. The board has been questioning my decisions for months. This would just give them the excuse they've been looking for. Madison sat beside him, her heart breaking. Jackson, what if we postponed the wedding? Just until things settle down? No. Jackson's head snapped up. Madison, don't you see? This is exactly what he wants. To make you doubt us, doubt yourself, to make you think you're not worth fighting for. But if marrying me costs you everything you've worked for, then I'll build something new, something better, something that's actually worth having. Jackson turned to face her fully. Madison, I would rather lose every penny I have than lose you. Do you understand that? Madison looked into his eyes and saw the man who had first surprised her by remembering how she took his coffee, who had learned to see the world through her eyes, who had chosen love over convention again and again. I understand, she whispered, and I love you for it. But Jackson, are you sure you're ready for the war we're about to fight? Jackson pulled her into his arms, holding her tight against his chest. I've never been more ready for anything in my life, he said. Tomorrow we're going to call Giuseppe and plan the wedding we actually want. And if the rest of the world doesn't like it, that's their problem. But as Madison closed her eyes and listened to Jackson's heartbeat, she couldn't shake the feeling that the hardest battles were still ahead of them, and that sometimes, love had to be stronger than everything else combined. The morning of their wedding, Madison woke up to find Jackson missing from their hotel room. She found him standing on the balcony of the small bed and breakfast they'd chosen in upstate New York, staring out at the rolling hills that would serve as the backdrop for their ceremony. His shoulders were tense, and she could see the weight of everything they'd been through etched in the lines of his face. Second thoughts? She asked softly, joining him at the railing. Jackson turned to her, and Madison saw something in his eyes that made her breath catch. Not doubt, but a fierce, protective love that seemed to burn brighter than the morning sun. Never, he said, pulling her close. But I got a call from my attorney an hour ago. The board voted. They're removing me as CEO effective Monday morning. Madison's heart clenched. Jackson, I'm so sorry. Don't be. Do you know what I felt when he told me? Relief. Jackson's smile was radiant. Madison, for the first time in my adult life, I'm free. Free to build something that matters. Free to be the man you've taught me I can be. But your company, everything you worked for, was never really mine anyway. It was my father's vision, my father's values, my father's version of success. Jackson cupped her face in his hands. Today, I'm marrying the woman I love. Tomorrow, we start building our own version of success. Together. 3 hours later, Madison stood at the edge of a meadow filled with wildflowers, her heart hammering against her ribs as she watched the small gathering of people they'd invited. Her father, Giuseppe, and his wife Lucia, a handful of Jackson's employees who had become genuine friends, and Dr. Sarah Chen from the pediatric ward who had always treated Madison with respect and kindness. Madison wore her mother's wedding dress, altered to fit her perfectly, and carried a bouquet of simple daisies and baby's breath that Jackson had picked for her that morning. There was no cathedral, no orchestra, no designer gown worth more than a car. There was just love, and the promise of a future they would build together. You ready, sweetheart? Thomas asked, offering her his arm. Madison looked ahead to where Jackson stood beneath an archway of wildflowers that Giuseppe had helped him construct at dawn. Jackson was wearing a simple navy suit, his hair slightly mussed by the breeze, and when their eyes met across the meadow, his smile was so full of joy that Madison felt tears spring to her eyes. I've never been more ready for anything in my life, she said. The ceremony was officiated by a local minister who had known the bed and breakfast owners for 30 years. There was no wedding march. Instead, Giuseppe's nephew played guitar while Lucia sang an Italian love song that needed no translation. As Madison walked down the aisle of trampled grass, she saw Jackson's expression transform from nervous anticipation to wonder to absolute certainty. When she reached him, he whispered, "You're so beautiful." And Madison knew he wasn't talking about the dress or the flowers or the picture-perfect setting. He was talking about this moment, this choice, this leap of faith they were taking together. "Dearly beloved," the minister began, his voice carrying across the meadow, "we are gathered here today to witness the union of two people who have found in each other not just love, but the courage to build a life that honors both their hearts and their values." The vows they'd written were simple, honest, and devastating in their sincerity. "Madison," Jackson said, his voice steady despite the tears in his eyes, "6 months ago I was sleepwalking through a life that looked successful from the outside but felt empty inside. You didn't just wake me up, you taught me what it means to be truly alive. You showed me that real strength isn't about controlling others, but about being vulnerable enough to let yourself be known and loved." He paused, his throat working. "I promise to spend every day trying to be worthy of the love you've shown me. I promise to build a life with you that honors both of us. And I promise to never, ever let the world convince me that you're anything less than the most extraordinary woman I've ever known." Madison's tears were flowing freely as she spoke her own vows. "Jackson, you saw me when I felt invisible. You valued me when the world told you I wasn't worth your time. You chose love over convention, kindness over profit, truth over appearances." Her voice grew stronger with each word. "I promise to stand beside you as we build something beautiful together. I promise to remind you every day that you're not just successful, you're good. And I promise to love you not for what you can give me, but for who you are when no one else is watching." When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Jackson kissed Madison with a tenderness that spoke of promises kept and dreams finally realized. The small crowd erupted in cheers, and Giuseppe shouted something in Italian that made his wife laugh and swat his arm. But the most magical moment came during the reception dinner that Giuseppe had prepared with his own hands. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink, Jackson stood and raised his glass. "I want to thank everyone who's here today," he said, his arm around Madison's waist. "Not just for celebrating with us, but for showing us what real community looks like. For the past 6 months, Madison and I have learned that love isn't about fitting into someone else's world. It's about creating a world that has room for both of you to grow." He looked down at Madison, his eyes shining. "We've also learned that the most important people in your life aren't the ones who applaud when everything is easy, but the ones who stand with you when everything is hard." Giuseppe stood up, his face beaming. "To love that conquers all," he declared, raising his wineglass. "To love that conquers all," the small gathering echoed. As the evening wound down and their guests began to drift away, Madison and Jackson found themselves alone beneath a canopy of stars. The fairy lights Giuseppe had strung through the trees twinkled like earthbound constellations, and the only sounds were the gentle rustle of leaves and the distant laughter of Giuseppe and Lucia as they cleaned up the dinner dishes. "Mrs. Blackwood," Jackson said softly, testing out her new name. "I like the sound of that," Madison replied, snuggling closer to her husband. "Any regrets?" Madison thought about the question seriously. 6 months ago, she had been a hospital aide living paycheck to paycheck, invisible to most of the world, focused only on taking care of her father and getting through each day. Now she was married to a man who had given up a fortune to be with her, facing an uncertain future but certain of their love. "Only one," she said finally. Jackson's body tensed. "What?" "I regret that we can't go back and do this day all over again. It was perfect." Jackson's laugh was pure relief and joy. "Well, we have the rest of our lives to create more perfect days." "What's the plan for those lives?" Madison asked. "Now that you're officially a free man?" Jackson was quiet for a moment, his fingers tracing patterns on her back. "I've been thinking about what you said months ago about wanting to teach, about the kids in the pediatric ward who need someone to read to them. What about it? What if we started a foundation? Nothing fancy, nothing corporate, just something real that helps kids who are fighting battles no child should have to fight. You could develop the programs, I could handle the business side. We could make a difference together." Madison pulled back to look at him, her heart full to overflowing. "You want to start a children's foundation? I want to build a life that matters. With you, for them, for us." Jackson's smile was soft and certain. "What do you think, Mrs. Blackwood? Ready to change the world?" Madison kissed him then, pouring all her love, all her hope. all her dreams for their future into that single, perfect moment. "I think," she said against his lips, "that we already have." And as they danced beneath the stars to music only they could hear, Madison realized that sometimes the most beautiful love stories aren't about finding someone who fits perfectly into your existing life. Sometimes they're about finding someone who makes you brave enough to build an entirely new life, one that's big enough to hold both your dreams and strong enough to weather any storm. The girl who had once been invisible had found a love that made her shine brighter than any spotlight. And the man who had once been lost in his own success had found a purpose worth more than any fortune. Together they had discovered that the greatest luxury in the world isn't money or power or status. It's being seen, being known, and being loved exactly as you are. Madison stood in the doorway of the children's reading room, watching her husband kneel beside a hospital bed where 8-year-old Emma Martinez clutched a worn copy of Charlotte's Web. "Will Charlotte really die?" Emma asked, her voice small and worried. Jackson's expression grew thoughtful, the same expression Madison had fallen in love with years ago, when he'd first started seeing the world through her eyes. "You know what I think?" he said gently. "I think Charlotte lives on in every life she touched, in Wilbur, in the farmer's daughter, in everyone who remembers her kindness." Emma nodded solemnly, as if this made perfect sense. "Like how my grandma lives on in me?" "Exactly like that," Jackson said, his voice warm with understanding. Madison felt the familiar tightness in her chest that came with watching Jackson work with the children. In the 5 years since they'd started the Parker Blackwood Foundation, she'd seen him transform from a man who had barely known how to relate to his own emotions into someone who could sit with a frightened child and offer exactly the comfort they needed. "Mrs. B," a voice called from behind her, and Madison turned to see Tyler Washington, now 13 and cancer-free for 2 years, approaching with his characteristic grin. "Did you see? I got into the summer arts program at Columbia." "Tyler." Madison pulled him into a hug, remembering the scared 9-year-old she'd first met during his treatment. "That's incredible. Your mom must be so proud." "She cried for like an hour," Tyler said, rolling his eyes but smiling. "Happy tears, though. She said to tell you thank you for believing in me when I didn't believe in myself." The foundation had grown beyond anything Madison and Jackson had initially imagined. What had started as a simple reading program had evolved into a comprehensive support system for children facing serious illnesses and their families. They provided educational support, arts therapy, family counseling, and something even more precious, hope. "Madison?" A familiar voice called from the hallway, and Madison turned to see Dr. Sarah Chen approaching with a clipboard and a smile. "Do you have a minute?" They walked to Sarah's office, past walls covered with artwork from the children they'd served, crayon drawings of families, watercolor rainbows, and hundreds of thank you cards that Jackson insisted on keeping every single one of. "I wanted to give you the quarterly numbers," Sarah said, settling behind her desk. "In the past 3 months alone, your programs have directly served over 300 children and their families. The reading program has expanded to 6 hospitals across the state. And the scholarship fund," she paused, her smile growing wider. "The scholarship fund just helped its 50th child attend college." Madison felt tears prick her eyes. 50 kids? 50 kids who might not have had that chance otherwise. "Madison, what you and Jackson have built here, it's changing lives in ways you may never fully understand." As Madison walked back to the reading room, she reflected on how much had changed since that morning 5 years ago, when she'd first sat behind the wheel of Jackson's Mercedes. The scared young woman who had worried about using the wrong fork at fancy dinners had become someone who spoke confidently at hospital board meetings, who had testified before the state legislature about children's health care needs, who had learned that her voice, her perspective, mattered. Jackson was now reading Where the Red Fern Grows to a group of 6 children, his voice doing different characters with the same dramatic flair he'd once brought to business presentations. Madison smiled, remembering how nervous he'd been the first time she'd asked him to read to the kids. "I don't know how to talk to children," he'd said. "Talk to them like they're people," she'd replied. "Because they are." It had been that simple, and that revolutionary, for a man who had grown up believing that vulnerability was weakness. After the reading session ended and they'd said goodbye to the children, Madison and Jackson walked hand in hand through Central Park, the same park where they'd shared their first real conversation, their first kiss, their first dreams of a future together. "Giuseppe called," Jackson said as they strolled along the reservoir. "He wants to cater the foundation's anniversary gala next month. Pro bono, as usual." Madison laughed. "We need to stop letting him do everything for free. Try telling him that. He says we gave him the greatest gift possible, a love story worthy of his grandmother's pasta. They paused at the same bench where Jackson had first told Madison he was falling in love with her. The autumn leaves drifted around them like confetti, and Madison marveled at how different everything looked now, not because the scenery had changed, but because she was seeing it through the eyes of someone who had learned to believe in her own worth. "I got a call today, too," Madison said, settling against Jackson's side. "From the mayor's office. They want to nominate the foundation for the humanitarian award." Jackson pulled back to look at her. "Madison, that's incredible. You should be so proud." "We should be proud," she corrected. "This is what we built together." Jackson was quiet for a moment, his fingers tracing patterns on her palm. "Do you ever think about where we'd be if your father hadn't had that heart attack? If you'd never gotten in that car?" Madison considered the question. "Sometimes. But then I remember what my mom used to say, that the best things in life come from the scariest decisions. And choosing to love you was definitely the scariest decision I'd ever made." "Scary how?" "Scary because I had to believe I was worth loving. Scary because I had to trust that someone could see past where I came from to who I really was. Scary because I had to have faith that love could be stronger than everything else." Jackson lifted their joined hands and kissed her knuckles, a gesture that had become as natural as breathing over the years. "And was it? Stronger than everything else?" Madison looked at her husband, this man who had walked away from a fortune to build something meaningful with her, who had learned to find joy in hospital reading rooms and foundation board meetings, who had chosen every day for 5 years to love not just her, but the life they'd created together. "It was stronger than fear," she said. "Stronger than other people's expectations. Stronger than the voices that told us we didn't belong together. And now I know that love isn't about finding someone who completes you. It's about finding someone who inspires you to complete yourself." As they sat together on that bench, watching the sun set over the city that had witnessed their entire love story, Madison's phone buzzed with a text from Tyler. "Mrs. B, I wrote a poem about second chances for my college application. Want to read it?" She showed the message to Jackson, who smiled. Another life touched. "Another dream made possible," Madison agreed. That evening they had dinner at Giuseppe's cafe, now expanded into the space next door but still maintaining its warm family atmosphere. Giuseppe and Lucia treated them like the children they'd never had, fussing over them and insisting they try new recipes. "You know what I love most about this place?" Madison said as they shared a plate of Giuseppe's famous tiramisu. "What?" "It feels like home. Real home. The kind of place where you're loved not for what you can do for people but for who you are." Jackson nodded, understanding. "Like what we've built with the foundation. Like what we've built together." As they walked back to their apartment, a modest 2-bedroom place in Brooklyn that they'd chosen because it felt like them rather than because it impressed anyone, Madison reflected on the journey that had brought them here. 5 years ago, she had been a woman who felt invisible, whose dreams seemed impossible, who believed that love like this only happened to other people. Now she was someone who knew her own worth, who had learned that the most radical thing you can do is refuse to make yourself smaller, to fit into other people's expectations. And Jackson, the man who had once measured his worth by the numbers in his bank account, had discovered that the richest life possible was one lived in service to something greater than yourself. "Do you remember what you said to me the night before our wedding?" Madison asked as they climbed the stairs to their apartment. "About being free for the first time in your adult life?" "I remember. I've been thinking about that. About freedom. And I realized that real freedom isn't about having unlimited choices. It's about having the courage to choose what matters most, even when it's scary." Jackson stopped on the landing and turned to face her fully. "And what matters most to you, Mrs. Blackwood?" Madison smiled. The same smile that had first captured Jackson's attention in a rearview mirror years ago. Genuine, unguarded, and full of quiet strength. "This," she said simply. "Us. The life we've built. The children we help. The love we've chosen to nurture every single day. Even when it's messy. Especially when it's messy. Because the messy parts are what make it real." As they settled into their evening routine, Jackson reviewing foundation reports while Madison graded papers from the teaching job she'd started 2 years ago, Madison felt the deep contentment that came from living a life aligned with your values. Her phone buzzed with a text from her father. "Saw the news article about the foundation today. Your mother would be so proud of the woman you've become." Madison showed the message to Jackson, who smiled. "He's right, you know, about your mother being proud. But more than that, I think she'd be amazed by the ripple effect of her daughter's courage." Ripple effect? Tyler's going to college and will probably become an artist who inspires other kids. Emma's going to grow up knowing that adults can be trusted to keep their promises. Sarah told me that 3 other hospitals are starting reading programs based on our model. Jackson set down his papers and pulled Madison close. You didn't just save me, Madison. You saved all the lives we've been able to touch together. That night, as Madison lay in Jackson's arms listening to the sounds of their neighborhood, sirens in the distance, neighbors talking on stoops, the rumble of the subway, she thought about the girl who had once driven a Mercedes through Manhattan's pre-dawn streets, worried about saying the wrong thing or using the wrong fork. That girl had been brave enough to answer a phone call at 3 a.m. and step into her father's shoes. Brave enough to bring coffee to a stranger who looked lonely. Brave enough to fall in love with someone who lived in a different world. Brave enough to believe that she deserved happiness. And that bravery had led to this, a life rich not in material wealth but in purpose, in connection, in the knowledge that every day held the possibility of making someone else's life a little bit better. Outside their window, the city hummed with millions of stories, millions of people searching for connection, for meaning, for love. And Madison smiled, knowing that tomorrow she and Jackson would wake up and continue writing their own story. Not the fairy tale ending the world expected, but something even better. A real love story. Messy and complicated, and absolutely perfect in its imperfection. The driver's daughter had found her happily ever after, not in a castle or a penthouse, but in the simple, extraordinary act of choosing love every single day. And the millionaire who had once been fascinated by her had discovered that the greatest fortune of all was a life shared with someone who saw you clearly and loved you anyway. In the end, that was enough. It was everything. Thank you for joining us on Madison and Jackson's journey. Your engagement with this story means everything to us. What did you learn from their love story? Would you have had the courage to choose love over security? What moment touched your heart the most? Your participation in our channel is very important, so please leave your thoughts in the comments below. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed the story, please subscribe to our channel and leave a comment below letting us know what you thought. Your feedback and support mean a lot to us. Stay tuned for more exciting stories.